Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for NOAA's Climate and Societal Interactions Nature-Based Solutions webinar series, first episode, Modeling Nature-Based Solutions for Decision Making. My name is Aaliyah Mejias, and I'm a Knaus Fellow with the Climate Adaptation Partnerships Program. And before we begin, please note this is being recorded and will be available to view on our website at a later time. My name is Aaliyah Mejias. I already said that, excuse me. And so just to begin, I'll share a brief overview of our webinar series before passing it off to my colleagues Jeannie Bay and Bhaskar Subramanian, who will share an overview of NOAA's programs. And the bulk of the time will be dedicated to our presenters to share their funded projects, and we'll have about 10 minutes for questions and answers afterwards. You can submit your questions through the GoToWebinar's question function, which is an icon with a question inside a speech bubble. This 5-part webinar series features projects funded by the Climate and Societal Interactions, or CSI, division's programs focused on research and application of equitable nature-based solutions, which are actions to protect and sustainably manage or restore natural or modified ecosystems to address societal challenges, simultaneously providing benefits for people and the environment. Each webinar episode will feature projects funded by CSI programs to demonstrate the diverse contributions to the body of nature-based solutions research and practice of implementation, as well as provide time for the audience to ask presenters questions. Our goal for this webinar series is to increase awareness of recent and current research on nature-based solutions funded by CSI and provide an opportunity to improve understanding, application, and evidence generated for decision-making to reduce climate risk through nature-based solutions. Each webinar series has a different focus, so we'll hope you'll join us next month and each month, but we're really excited to have so many registrants representing a variety of sectors with us today. With that, let's shift to Jeannie Bay to learn more about NOAA's Climate Program Office, CSI, and Climate Adaptation Partnerships Program.
Thank you, Aaliyah, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are absolutely thrilled to have such a wide attendance for the first episode of our webinar series on NOAA's Climate and Societal Interactions Division's contribution to the world of nature-based solutions. My name is Jeannie Bay, and I am a program specialist supporting the CAP program. We wanted to start off by first providing some situational awareness of where our division sits within NOAA. NOAA is within the Department of Commerce, and the NOAA Climate Program Office is hosted under the Oceanic and Atmospheric Research Line Office. Next slide, please. Aaliyah, I don't know if you switched this. Oh, there we go. Thank you. So the Climate Program Office comprises a set of physical science research. Sorry, back one slide. Comprises a set of physical science research programs, climate adaptation-focused research and engagement programs, integrated information systems on heat and drought, and a communications, education, and engagement division. In addition to advancing fundamental research, CPO hosts a number of useful public-facing resources such as heat.gov, drought.gov, climate.gov, and the U.S. Climate Resilience Toolkit. Next slide, please. So the Climate and Societal Interactions Division within CPO supports research that seeks to generate the knowledge, tools, and institutional networks that enhance society's capacity to anticipate, plan for, and adapt to climate impacts. Our focus complements the work of the physical science research and development portfolio across NOAA by using insights from social science research to interpret, synthesize, and apply climate data, analysis, and observations. Programmatically, this is what CSI looks like today. It is a science policy, research, and engagement enterprise that brings to NOAA an emphasis on individuals and communities and the ongoing decisions involved in the process of adapting to climate, both here and abroad. CSI is home to 2 unique programs, the Climate Adaptation Partnerships Program, formerly known as the Regional Integrated Sciences and Assessments, or RISA program, and the Adaptation Sciences Program, or we call it ADSCI. So now we'll provide a little bit of background about each program within CSI to help you better understand the research approaches and the role that each program plays in the projects being presented today. Next slide, please. So starting with CAP. The mission of the CAP program is to advance equitable adaptation through sustained regional research and community engagement. We accomplish this by supporting a network of regional teams through competitively awarded 5-year cooperative agreements in multi-state regions across the US. Teams are composed of experts and local partners working across a diverse range of sectors and with urban and rural communities, as well as local, state, and tribal governments on their cross-sectoral climate adaptation needs. Research topics can include things like infrastructure and the built environment, public health, small business resilience, work with utilities, city and town planning, among others. In recent years, the network has begun focusing more directly on equity and tackling the complex, compound stressors, both climate and socioeconomic, faced by communities, and has focused more attention to engaging with frontline communities in search of this type of expertise and partnership. So on the right of this slide is our ring graphic, which depicts the CAP process, which includes the establishment of trust between partners, needs being defined by the community, research designed to meet the needs of the community, participation by the community being critical to success, and benefits being received by and useful to the community. It is within these actions and outcomes that novel climate solutions are developed. The CAP program represents a long-term investment toward this mission, as the program is 25 years old, and our vision is to continue investing in existing regions and expanding into areas that are not yet covered by the program for the long haul. Next slide, please. So here is a map of our current CAP network of regional teams. We have 13 CAP teams that make up the network, and those are depicted in solid colors on the slide. We are working hard to reach full national coverage, but that is largely dependent on congressional appropriations. And one of the projects that you'll hear from today is being presented by our Mid-Atlantic team. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned before, CAP teams determine the research they engage in alongside the communities that they serve, taking into account the unique environmental, socioeconomic, and cultural variables of their regions. CAP approaches nature-based solutions work by applying our programmatic level lens of integrating social and physical sciences and considering complex compounding hazards and co-benefits. This holistic lens allows for challenging more conventional approaches to nature-based solutions work that might be more focused or solely focused on engineering and design, and rather emphasizes the importance of considering societal and community level variables. Significantly, CAP's work spans both coastal and inland communities, making our investments in nature-based solutions distinct from many other NBS-focused programs at NOAA that tend to be more concentrated in coastal zones. So the NBS-focused work funded through CAP can be loosely categorized into these buckets, which include informing decision support and community planning, identifying trade-offs and co-benefits, advancing equity and workforce development, as well as analysis and evaluation of projects once implemented. More specifically, CAP has funded work on developing community-wide green infrastructure master plans, examining the intersection of extreme heat, human health, and nature-based solutions, conducting vulnerability assessments for stormwater managers, and transforming vacant, neglected, and underutilized land into a matrix of green infrastructure, just to name a few projects. So during this series, you'll hear from some of the researchers themselves who carried out projects like these. From here, I will turn things over to my colleague Bhaskar from CAP's sister program, Adaptation Sciences. Thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you, Jeannie. My name is Bhaskar, just like NASCAR. I co-manage a research program called Adaptation Science, or ADSci for short. Just before I get started, I just want to make sure that folks who are in the pathway of the Hurricane Helene, that they stay safe. Let's get started. As was mentioned before, the ADSci program is a sister program of CAP and was established in 2021. Three legacy programs, COCA, SARP, and IRAP, were melded together to create the current ADSci program. The goal of the program is to advance knowledge, methods, and framework to move society beyond incremental adaptation to a more widespread, connected, and transformative adaptation pathway. Now, the two key objectives of the program are: one, to develop an understanding of key drivers and conditions that shape and enable adaptation. Number two, identifying and promoting opportunities for the use of climate information to support preparedness and planned adaptation. Next slide, please. The Adaptation Science program prides itself on excelling at blending research, partnership, and engagement. AdSci supports work conducted both within the US by co-leading partnership just like the DOT partnership called the Climate Smart Transportation, and outside the United States by leveraging US Department of State funding on projects such as the Island-Led Resilience 2030 and NOAA's Blue Carbon Inventory project. AdSci also provides technical collaboration and capacity building by leveraging funding in areas such as fisheries, the CAFA program, and coastal resilience. Next slide, please. AdSci encourages and supports research that generates knowledge, tools, and institutional networks to enhance society's ability to anticipate, plan for, and adapt to climate impacts. In short, we take a systems approach and strategically look at compounding events and their cascading impacts. We shape and implement our program priorities by participating in various federal work groups and project-specific cross-agency collaboration. A good example in the NBS space is the FEMA guidebook called Building Community Resilience with NBS, and the Commission for Environmental Cooperation, a partnership between Canada, US, and Mexico, that effort called the Monitoring the Efficacy of Nature-Based Solutions, Proposed Methodology and Indicator. NBS is a space that AdSci has invested in the past. Moving forward, we'd like to focus more in this space by amplifying our investments in the future by using past work as a springboard. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bhaskar and Jeannie. Really appreciate that background. And so in this first episode of our series, 3 principal investigators will discuss funded work modeling nature-based solutions to influence design making at various scales. We'll learn of their process and the unique ways they thought about applying modeling and its broader impacts. And I'm excited to introduce Marissa Weber and Nastaran Tebayanian, who will present on their work to support integrated modeling and decision support for stormwater managers, which was funded in part by CAP's Mid-Atlantic team. In 2024, Marissa Weber joined the Earth, Marine, and Environmental Sciences Department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as a postdoctoral research associate. She received her PhD in Civil and Environmental Engineering at Carnegie Mellon University, which she recently graduated from. Congratulations. And the work being presented today was completed as part of her PhD dissertation. She received her MS from Carnegie Mellon University in 2019 and her BSc from Princeton University in 2018, both in civil and environmental engineering. Her research is focused on climate adaptation for flooding hazards, specifically quantifying flood risks for urban areas and essential infrastructure under climate change, identifying how stakeholders are using climate data under deep uncertainty, and assessing how green infrastructure and nature-based solutions can be implemented as effective and equitable adaptation strategies. Outside of research, she enjoys other activities centered around water, such as swimming for exercise, walking along creekside trails, and visiting the beach with her family in her home country of Jamaica. Welcome, Marissa. Nastaran Tebayanian is a research scientist at the Water Institute and has worked on a diverse set of research projects, from the regional assessment of cultural and natural resources to developing computer-aided design tools for resilient urban landscape design. Nastaran received her bachelor's degree in architectural engineering, master's of landscape design, master's of science in landscape architecture, master's of applied statistics, and a PhD in architecture. Bringing together all of her interests, Nastaran focuses on decision sciences such as decision-making under deep uncertainty to help decision makers define their problem and work through sometimes competing interests to facilitate decision-making with a particular community or agency. Nastaran focuses most of her work on environmental planning challenges and climate change adaptation tailored to a specific community or region. In her previous role, she worked as a researcher at the Penn State Initiative for Resilient Communities and an adjunct researcher at RAND Frederick S. Pardee Center for Longer Range Global Policy and the Future Human Condition. She was also part of the cohort of Landscape U, a National Science Foundation research traineeship in regenerative landscape science at Penn State. Welcome, Nasrin, and thank you both for being here with us today. And as a reminder for our participants, please use the question function to submit any questions you may have about their work. You guys can take it from here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the introduction and thanks for the opportunity to present our work today. Nasrin and I are going to talk about some of the work we've done in an urban watershed in Pittsburgh that has experienced repeated flooding issues in the past. And our project is funded by the Mid-Atlantic Climate Adaptation Partnership. So I'll talk about our work to develop a dual drainage model to evaluate flood hazards under climate change. And then I'll hand over to Nastran to talk about the work that she led to support the development of multifunctional green infrastructure planning systems in the face of deep uncertainty in the Mid-Atlantic region. Next. I'll start with a brief look at modeling and how urban stormwater modeling can help to inform the design and planning and maintenance of climate-resilient stormwater infrastructure, such as green infrastructure. We're using a dual drainage model, which is recommended for urban flood modeling, and which basically means that the model represents and allows for this interaction between the flows that happen underground, for example, in a pipe, and the flows that happen on the surface, for example, in a street or another surface channel. Once we calibrate and validate these models, meaning that we know that they are useful representations of reality, we can use these models for adaptation planning, including planning for climate-resilient green infrastructure systems. Particularly in urban areas, flooding is not simply a physical problem, but also has these social implications, which means that we need to communicate and collaborate with stakeholders throughout all stages of the modeling process. And lastly, we're interested in climate resilience, which means that we have to consider the deep uncertainty of climate change, as well as the uncertainty associated with the model parameters. For example, how do we represent how pervious or impervious a surface is in an urban watershed? Next slide. This is a map showing the Negley Run watershed that we're focusing on today and the smaller Homewood neighborhood inside of it that represents the study area that I'll be talking about. The labeled dots that you can see represent different monitoring areas in the watershed that were used to answer two main research questions. How can we address the model parameter uncertainty that is associated with a dual drainage model like the one we're using? And how are flooding risks distributed in the watershed and under climate change? Next slide. I'll give a brief overview of our methodology and then highlight three takeaways from our work. We're starting with an existing model, which we expanded on and extended in areas where the community and other stakeholders related to local boundary organizations in the watershed indicated that they repeatedly or regularly see flooding happening in their communities. However, where we chose to do monitoring and therefore modeling work was also influenced by feedback from the point of view of the city and the consultants who were conducting the monitoring campaign in 2022. Through their work and the data collection was what made this research possible and allowed us to complete the first step of our method, which was the calibration and validation of our model. We conducted a sensitivity analysis and used two calibration approaches to get a better idea of the model parameter uncertainty. Next slide. We then used a decision analysis framework to find the optimal set of model parameters that could represent the flow in the watershed for the storms that we observed. Next. And then the last step of our model, of our method, is to use this calibrated model to analyze flooded infrastructure in the watershed. We can represent climate change by using design storms that are commonly used in the city and applying a change factor from the local Pittsburgh Stormwater Design Manual. And when we're looking at where or how this watershed is seeing flooding happening, we define it in kind of two ways, looking at flooding that's happening below the surface or in the flooded junctions, and flooding that's happening on the surface, so flooded streets. Next. So on to our three main takeaways. And the first one is that models like the one we are using can help stakeholders to identify areas that are flooding hotspots in their watersheds. These two maps on this slide are showing the flooding that we modeled, and on the left-hand side is showing kind of the least intense scenario. The right-hand side is showing the most intense scenario. The potentially flooded junctions or underground sections are in blue circles, and the potentially flooded streets are in red lines. And you can see that regardless of which scenario we look at, the model is showing flooding in some similar locations. Next. One of these locations that's particularly important is the area of Washington Boulevard. And there's been repeatedly flooding happening in this area of the city. And so it's a good thing that we're seeing agreement between our model and previous observations as well as previous modeling work. Places where it always floods are also places where stakeholders can begin to think about where to implement no-regret strategies and solutions, such as green infrastructure and nature-based solutions. Next. Our second takeaway is that our flooding response was subject to uncertainty. And there are at least two types of uncertainty that affected our model estimates of flooding: uncertainty due to the model parameters themselves and uncertainty due to climate change. And we found that the increased flooding due to the model parameter uncertainty is comparable in some cases to the increased flooding that's due to climate change, as illustrated by this bar graph on the slide. This means that our modeling efforts need to take both of these uncertain factors into account when we're making future decisions. Next. Lastly, we note that the flooding response is also nonlinear, and this means that a linear increase in precipitation can lead to a nonlinear increase in flooding. This graph is showing the flooded infrastructure on the y-axis for a 10-year storm, with the bars showing the fractional increase in flooded infrastructure for the initial or the prior model and for the calibrated or the optimized model. And we can see that all of the horizontal bars are greater than the vertical line that represents a fractional increase in precipitation. So this means that even if we have an idea of how much our precipitation is going to increase, so for example, if we think precipitation might increase by up to 20%, we should maybe expect that our flooding and the risk associated with precipitation should increase by more than 20%. Next. So to wrap up this section of the presentation, our dual drainage modeling in this watershed was able to highlight a couple of lessons learned for climate change adaptation, flooding, and implementation of green infrastructure in this watershed. We found that our evaluation of flooded infrastructure identified potential block scale risks of flooding in this watershed in Pittsburgh, and we highlight the importance of incorporating sources of uncertainty and nonlinearity into the adaptation and planning efforts to ensure that stormwater infrastructure and green infrastructure systems are climate resilient. And with that, I'll hand it off to Nastra.
Thank you, Marissa. So in this part of the presentation, I'll talk about another research study funded by Mid-Atlantic RISA that provides modeling capabilities and decision support insights for stormwater managers and planners. And more specifically, I'll talk about green infrastructure placement under deep uncertainty. Next slide, please. So here I want to step back a bit to talk about the context of this research. We know that climate change is expected to increase the intensity, duration, and frequency of extreme weather events, such as heavy rainfall. And at the same time, urbanization changes natural hydrological systems by altering drainage patterns and adding impervious surfaces. And both of these factors can lead to more frequent and severe stormwater challenges, including urban flooding. But our understanding of how urban systems and particularly drainage systems respond to these changes is limited. And despite this, current spatial planning interventions are often based on past conditions or limited scenarios of the future rather than systematic considerations of future uncertainties. Next. So traditionally, we have used hard engineering solutions such as systems of pipes and catch basins and so on to manage stormwater. And as opposed to that, cities around the world increasingly use green infrastructure for managing stormwater. And the principal idea for green infrastructure is capturing rain where it falls. Next. But in addition to stormwater benefits, green infrastructure provides multiple other environmental, social, and economic benefits. Next. So here in this context, spatial planning of multifunctional green infrastructure under uncertainty is very challenging. Not limited to green infrastructure planning, but in many spatial planning practices, the traditional practice is to design one solution for the world we know from the past, while existing research and practice compares very few planning alternatives in pre-specified scenarios. And in contrast to these two methods, decision-making under deep uncertainty, or DMDU, searches and samples planning alternatives and scenarios across a wide range. Next. So when dealing with multifunctionality and uncertainty, such as in green infrastructure planning, many objective robust decision-making, or MORDAM, which is a DMDU approach, offers powerful capabilities. MORDAM consists of four main components: problem formulation, generating alternatives, uncertainty analysis, and scenario discovery with trade-off analysis. Next. So to address these challenges of modeling multifunctionality and uncertainty in green infrastructure planning, we developed an open source tool that combines a Python package for MORDM with a very frequently used tool for stormwater and green infrastructure modeling, the EPA Stormwater Management Model, or SWIM. And combining SWIM with Rhodium provides new and unique capabilities. Next. So we use some of these capabilities to answer a research question in Negri Run watershed in Pittsburgh. And the question here was, how does considering rainfall uncertainty change the spatial allocation of multifunctional green infrastructure investments? Next. So a typical first step in MORDM process is problem formulation. And this diagram shows the components of problem formulation that the current version of the tool supports, with the blue text representing what we focused in the Negri-Run case study. We formulate a problem by specifying uncertainties, policy levers, system relationships, and objectives. And in terms of policy levers, we looked at the location and size of green infrastructure. So we wanted to know where to place the new green infrastructure investments and what size they should be. In terms of uncertainties, we looked at uncertainties in rainfall. In terms of system relationships, at the center we have a SWIM model and also downscale climate projections. In terms of objectives, we focus on minimizing runoff volume, maximizing placement areas with community priorities for implementation, and minimizing cost. Next. So we use Rhodium analytic capabilities to perform several analyses. And for example, here we performed and compared the results of multi-objective optimization with and without uncertainty. And the figure here shows the results of that comparison. Here on this plot, the lighter blue dots show the simulation runs of multi-objective optimization, and the pink dots show the Pareto set resulting from that optimization. And the darker blue dots on the right side of the figure show simulation runs from the robust optimization, and the red dots show Pareto satisficing optimal solutions resulting from that robust optimization. So the analysis here shows that when considering rainfall uncertainty, the optimal solutions suggest significantly higher investments. And this is mainly because considering rainfall uncertainty from different sources sample much higher intensity rainfall events, which subsequently result in more runoff and require larger green infrastructure investments to manage it. Next. But it's not only the amount of investment that changes when we consider uncertainty. The spatial pattern of higher investment also shifts. So the color represents 5 categories of investments, with green and yellow indicating higher investments. And this is the result of optimization without uncertainty. And moving to the next slide, which represents the optimization with uncertainty. You can see an increase and change in location of the green and yellow subcatchments, which are the highest investment subcatchments. So we might need not only have higher investments, but also investments in different areas when accounting for multiple objectives and uncertainties. Next. Okay, I would like to wrap up my presentation by highlighting 2 key strengths of this tool. So first is flexibility. This tool can be applied to guide the placement of multifunctional green infrastructure in various settings. For example, this tool has already been used or proposed for stormwater and green infrastructure studies in New Orleans and in Chesapeake Bay watershed. And second is the integration of multifunctionality and uncertainty that I pointed out throughout the presentation. And this, for example, allows for incorporating social co-benefits and exploring uncertainty in both environmental and socioeconomic factors. Next. Yes, thanks so much for listening, and we're looking forward to hearing your comments and questions later in the session.
Thank you so much, Nasserun and Marissa. We really appreciate that overview. So our next presentation and project is funded by the Adaptation Sciences Program and focuses on using collaborative modeling to answer how diverse stakeholders, from empowered decision makers to at-risk groups impacted by decisions, perceive and prioritize the benefits, consequences, and trade-offs of shoreline social ecological systems and adaptation decisions. I'm excited to introduce Stephen Cyphers, who will present on this work. Stephen is an associate professor in the School of Marine and Environmental Sciences and an associate professor of sociology in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work at the University of South Alabama. He is South's first chief sustainability officer and a senior marine scientist at the Dauphin Island Sea Lab. Stephen's research integrates ecology and sociology to understand and develop strategies to overcome major coastal community challenges. His work focuses on sustainable coastal fisheries, shoreline development, ecosystem restoration, and climate adaptation. Stephen was awarded a Science, Engineering, and Education for Sustainability Fellowship from the National Science Foundation. He received his BS in Marine Biology at Auburn University and his PhD in Marine Science at the University of South Alabama and Dauphin Island Sea Lab in 2012. Stephen was a tenured associate professor at Northeastern University before returning to the University of South Alabama in 2022. Welcome, Stephen, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Aaliyah, and thank you to NOAA for putting on this webinar series, and definitely to the Climate Program and AdSci programs for supporting our work. I'm grateful for the opportunity to talk about our project. It's got collaborative in the title, and it is definitely highly collaborative on our team. So lots of folks contributed to what we're working on and where we hope to go. I'll also mention that our project is a little bit unique in that we had some delay in my transition among universities. So we're only about a year into the project. So you're going to get to see what we've done and hopefully a little bit on where we're hoping to go over the next year. But before I start, I also want to just echo what Bhaskar said in his comments. I'm down on the Alabama Gulf Coast, and so we are definitely thinking about our friends and colleagues over in Florida over the next couple of days. So, yeah, transitioning, I think this image is one of my, the first image was one of my favorites of where we work. That's a Florida Keys image there, and it really sums up what we're working on in our project. So you can see to the right, you can see some really nice mangroves. To the left, you can see a seawall. And then around the edges, you can see the things that a lot of folks care about. So the ability to access the water, what looks to be really good clean water. And then just outside the left are some of the hotels that align some of the neighborhoods in Key West. So it really is a social ecological system. And when you think about managing these systems under climate change or development, it's really about trade-offs. And so our project is a social science project, trying out a few different methods, hopefully in a toolkit way to provide communities some resources to think through their planning. Next slide, please. But I first want to talk just a little bit of background on what led us to the work that we do specifically with nature-based solutions. And so for most folks on this webinar, it's probably very familiar, the history of shoreline development in the United States. It's really nicely summed up in a paper by one of our colleagues, Rachel Gitman, that highlighted as U.S. populations have grown and moved towards the coastlines through time, so has shoreline armoring. And in a lot of areas, this shoreline hardening intersects some of our places that are most ecologically important, like the Florida Keys where we work and like Mobile, Alabama, where I live now. But as that same kind of history of armoring has continued, we've really had a shift towards nature-based solutions, particularly in terms of recognizing their benefits for coastal protection, but also all of the other co-benefits for society there. And we're at the point now to where there's books and there's national level guidance coming out on the biophysical and ecology aspects of these kinds of systems. Next slide, please. And at the same time, there's more and more work coming out on the human dimensions, the social and economic aspects. And so this is some work that we've done that we've collaborated in a lot of different regions and really tries to help show what coastal residents or other stakeholders perceive about our shorelines. And so in this quick example, you can see some comparisons here in perceptions of different shoreline structures. So two hardened structures in the red and the purple, and then more natural and nature-based strategies in the green. And what's important to take away here is that for some of the things that coastal residents and others right along the coastline care about, with cost effectiveness and durability and those types of things, they typically still perceive traditional hardening structures to be more effective. But if you look down to aesthetics, they also recognize that these typically they prefer the natural landscapes, and they recognize that the traditional armoring causes more environmental harm. So these are trade-offs that residents are already recognizing. These were done in a marsh system, which is quite different than the mangrove systems we're working on in the Keys. But it's really what motivated us to try to look in places where you actually see in that cover image a mangrove existing in front of a seawall, which is not something we see very much in the Northern Gulf, to where you more often see those bulkheads put in place and then you kind of lose the natural habitat. Next slide, please. So, we first started working in the Keys about 10 years ago and doing a lot of social science surveys. And one of the things that immediately jumped out was residents perceive a lot of benefits from both mangroves and seawalls. They overall see both of them as beneficial for the system. But we started realizing that it's in very different ways and that there were a lot of trade-offs involved. Next slide, please. And so that led to our AdSci proposal, to where we ultimately wanted to ask the question of, in a system like the Florida Keys, to where you can have mangroves and seawalls coinciding very diverse social systems. So the image down in the bottom shows you a really high income gated community right next to a more lower working class community that has a lot of vulnerable infrastructure in it, neighboring with mangroves and seawalls side by side. How are these systems making decisions on the social side of what shoreline structures go in place, whether it's mangroves or seawalls, thinking about conservation and planning decisions in that space, who's making the decisions, and then ultimately, what does this translate to in terms of costs and benefits for the individual waterfront residents or the coastal communities more broadly, particularly in a place like the Keys, where there's a high reliance on tourism and there's just, really dynamic coastal communities. Next slide, please. And so our project is attacking this big overarching question through kind of 3 steps. And I'm really going to focus most on the first question today. But our first question is, when you're thinking about a place like this and the connections to the coast, everyone is connected in some way. But who are the groups that are the most connected to coastal adaptation decisions or flooding? And then how connected or isolated are those to the ones that are thinking about, conservation and nature-based solution strategies? So we've focused on social network analysis as our starting point. And then from there, we're going to build into more collaborative modeling, trying to understand how the system is connected and where the trade-offs are. And then lastly, we're planning to bring a lot of these things together in workshops with diverse stakeholders to visualize and talk through trade-offs and try to understand how it may link to satisfaction with various outcomes, and then how it may translate to planning tools for other geographies and things like that. Next slide, please. And so for this first step, this is what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about, and I'll show a picture on the next slide, but this is really one of the projects of a graduate student in my lab that's working on, is interviewing lots of groups throughout the Florida Keys, trying to understand how often they connect and work with each other, specifically around the areas of coastal flooding. And so we started our project with a structured stakeholder assessment to try to understand who were all of the groups that have an influence on coastal decision making, and then who are the groups that are influenced by it. And we really focused on flooding, and we also focused on underserved and disadvantaged groups in many ways. So you can see in this image to the left, this is one of our students down there doing interviews, and she's at a public park with an ADA accessible fishing site, but it also frequently floods on high tides. So thinking through, these types of trade-offs and these types of, complicated issues with coastal protection. So, and the specific question we asked in these interviews was, who are your collaborators? Who are your partners? So you can see the image now here. This is a picture of Sarah doing one of the interviews with one of our residents who consented to having his photo taken there. And what we do with this is, so we ask that question among individuals who represent different types of stakeholders or different specific groups. And with them, we ask them, who are they working with on issues either related to coastal flooding or issues related to nature-based solutions. And then from those answers, we're building social networks to visualize how closely or distantly connected these groups are. And so when you look over to the right, you can see a couple of things already. First, there's this one big network where there's lots of groups that are connected. And then if you look really closely out around the edges, you start to see these kind of disparate, isolated groups to where there might be 2 or 3, or there might be a larger group. And so what I want to do just a little bit is just dig into this image and show you some of the things that we're starting to find. So next slide, please. So when we take that first image and we start to layer organization labels on top of it, it gets really messy, first of all. So sorry, these kind of graphs are messy. But this is that core image. You can kind of see that second little cluster off to your right. But I want to zoom in even a little bit more here to show you some of the key questions that we had were, are the groups working on the environmental aspects of nature-based solutions connected at all to the groups that were focused on social vulnerability related to coastal hazards? And so next slide, please. And the couple of areas I wanted you to look at in the map are the two that the circles just moved. So first was up top, and you could see there a little group. There's a lot of United Way organizations that'll jump out next. And then the next one is really kind of the core of the graph. So the ones that are right in the middle and connected to a lot. And so when you're good, next slide, please. So when you pull these two sections out to look at them a little bit closer, you can see a couple of things. So first, let's start over to the right. And you can see when you click on the organization that's firm, and this is an organization that's based in the Florida Keys that's focused on insurance and particularly residential insurance, you can see that they're a really tight conduit and really centrally connected to all of the Habitat for Humanity organizations that also work on affordable housing. And they are also the direct pathway through to FEMA, which is your emergency management organization at the federal level, as well as a nonprofit organization called Last Stand. And so Last Stand is a community-based organization. I put a little bit of info of them on the left side to show that they're a long-standing organization that's really deeply connected into the community. And in this case, seems to be connected to this residential element as well. And if you continue to trace that line down, you'll jump to the graph in the bottom left and see that Last Stand in this long-standing community-based organization is also the facilitator to a lot of other organizations that are really influential in not only coastal protection and flooding, but also nature-based solutions and environmental conservation. So the Florida Keys Marine Sanctuary, the county level infrastructure, as well as the Army Corps and Florida DEP and some of these big agencies. So we came in with a hypothesis thinking that the environmental groups and the more socially oriented groups wouldn't be super well connected, but we actually found out that they are connected, although sometimes these relationships are formal through organization like advisory boards like the sanctuary has, and sometimes they're more informal among two individuals working together. So that's a step where we're going next with these analyses, is to try to do a more refined look at formal and informal bonds within this type of network, and then create tools to visualize those going forward. Next slide, please. But we want to emphasize as well that that was really just the core of the graph, and there's still a lot of groups that are not connected. So there's a lot that are still left out, and some of these are pretty important stakeholder groups like shore-based fishers that don't really have a collective representing them, and they're not well integrated. So thinking through that part and how there's synergies there is something we're still working on. Next, please. But so what we're doing next, and this is kind of going to be a quick just push through our next two phases. So our next two questions are, how among these groups that we're hoping to represent their views of the system, how do they see the social ecological system of flooding and nature-based solutions? And we're going to draw directly from the social networks to select who we interview, and having some that are well connected, weakly connected, and not connected. and then build conceptual models like you see over to the right. Next slide. And just for those who are less familiar with collaborative modeling, or specifically in this case, fuzzy cognitive mapping. So this is a strategy that we use in a lot of our research, and particularly our collaborator, Stephen Gray, built a software that I'll show on the next slide, is used to represent a complex system of how a bunch of things are connected to other things. And ultimately, this is the way people see systems. And there's a lot of advantages to this, because we can do interviews to build conceptual models, and we can include things like water quality. We can include things like satisfaction that are either abstract or aggregate. We can model feedbacks. I highlighted the other one in orange and italics because it's not actually the fastest way of doing this. There's a lot of literature that says this is easy and fast. It's actually a lot of work, depending on the way you do it. But what we really like is you can visualize policy scenarios at the end. Next, please. And so this is just a quick screenshot of the software. If you've never used it before or seen it, it's freely available. It's called Mental Modeler. Some of what we're doing in this project is developing guidelines for using it in adaptation planning. But Stephen Gray's at Michigan State, and he's a great resource on this, and very collaborative when folks reach out to him. Next, please. But ultimately, when you build those models, like you've seen in the last couple of slides, the real power in this software is being able to go in and, in a meeting, allow residents or stakeholders or community members to make suggestions of change. What if we did this? What if we increased bulkheads? And you can go in and run that scenario in real time and say, well, here's what the model would predict. You might get an increase in property values, but you're going to get a decrease in mangroves. Are you happy with that? Are you satisfied with that scenario? And allow you to have a real iterative kind of co-learning activity. Next, please. And so we're really right in the midst of this right now. I just threw one example model up to show you that sometimes we do these, and in this case, mangroves and seawalls never came up in the initial model. So when we're asking folks about flooding, they're not thinking about that level of coastal protection. They're thinking about insurance and gentrification. So we're building that into our next phase on how we tie all of these things together, depending on the very diverse interests of these stakeholder groups. Next, please. And so, where we've been and where we're at, what we're seeing so far from the social network analysis is that the social vulnerability groups and the environmental groups actually are more connected than we hypothesized, although sometimes it's pretty weak bonds that may be informal. Our initial mental models are very divergent. Sometimes flooding is the only concept linking different groups, and some groups are thinking about mangroves and others are thinking about insurance and gentrification. The next kind of step that we're going forward towards is finishing these interviews and building models that we'll report back in our workshops to look at management and climate scenarios. And then ultimately our overall goal is to produce some guidance and tools on how to repeat this process in other communities if it turns to be useful and something that the residents are seeing value in representing their views of the system and also communicating trade-offs, which is kind of our overall goal. Next, please. And so that's it. Thank you again for the opportunity. Thank you to AdSci for supporting our project and for giving us this opportunity.
Well, thank you, Stephen. We are so grateful for you to join us today and present. And let's shift to question and answers, and Jeannie will be moderating for us.
Thank you, Aaliyah, and thank you very much to Marissa, Nastaran, and Stephen for sharing your super interesting research findings and insights with us. We're lucky to have you all here today. As a reminder, if folks have any questions for the presenters, you can submit them using the questions feature in the GoToWebinar platform. We have already received a number of questions, so we can go ahead and get started with those. The first one is a bit about housekeeping. So a few people have asked, will the recording of the webinar be available? The answer is yes. We plan to post the webinar recording on the NOAA Climate and Societal Interactions webinar webpage, and that hopefully should happen within the next week. But something that might occur before then would be, we'll also be emailing all of the webinar participants the recording once it's ready to be shared. So From here, we can transition to our first question, which we received from Caroline Ridley with the EPA, and it is directed to Marissa and Nastaron. The question is, what contributes to the nonlinearity of potential flooding?
Sure, I can start with that if that's okay, Nastra. Thank you for that question. I think one of the main things that contributes towards the nonlinearity is that we have a tendency to equate hazard with risk when really there are a number of connecting steps between those two things. The hazard in this case being our precipitation and the risk being the flooding that happens. Things such as the way that a city is organized or the way that infrastructure is set up, on the physical side of things, as well as a number of social aspects, can really affect what happens between the hazard or the precipitation or the rainfall and the risk, which is the flooding and how that affects the people who are in the community. Nastra, did you want to add anything to that?
I think that was a perfect answer.
Thanks.
Jeannie, you're muted.
Thank you. Thanks for that response, Marissa. Our next question comes from a participant named Abigail, and the question is also directed to Marissa. It reads, were you able to compare flooding hotspots from the model, to actual historic or current flooding experiences in the watershed?
Yeah, thanks for your question. We didn't get to do this as much as we had hoped. On some level, we do have a comparison of where there are kind of these big areas of flooding in terms of these particular streets or these areas of the community. But our next steps and kind of work that we have to do in the future is to drill down even further to the block scale and to look not only at design storms, which are what we looked at, are the results I presented today, but to look more at historical storms to be able to have a better comparison to actual historical flooding. Thanks.
Got it. Thank you, Marissa. We have another question from Caroline Ridley, and it reads, what kind of co-benefits do you envision could be captured using rhodium swim? Are there any that will be difficult to capture, either because the modeling architecture isn't appropriate or because there isn't data on the relationship between the green infrastructure practice and the co-benefit?
Yeah, this is a great question. Obviously, as any multifunctional modeling work, capturing the social benefit is very tricky. And as you mentioned, some of that comes from the lack of data, but also not only lack of data in general, but lack of local data that's actually relevant to that decision context. So for example, what we did with sample co-benefit analysis, that we used literature that looked at different co-benefits, for example, both environmental and social, for example, access to park, including like air pollution reduction, different things, and then coming up with a dollar amount for that. So there was a lot of reduction in that process, and sometimes that also very correlated with cost. So it's not that much insightful when you have something that, just like the opposite of cost in a linear way. So that's definitely a very challenging component to model. But this is the objective side, but also there's uncertainty side, But when we look at the socioeconomic uncertainty, that's also always very challenging.
Thank you, Nastaron, for that response. We're receiving a lot of questions, and we've got a couple for Stephen at this point. So the first question, Stephen, is from Katie Can with Rutgers University, and it reads, so she's curious to hear a bit more about your findings related to gentrification. Did you hear different perspectives on gentrification from respondents when discussing gray versus green infrastructure interventions?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. And no, not directly yet on that side. So much about gentrification. I mean, it is one of the absolute most brought up social issues, especially in the lower keys when you're close to Key West. But it's almost exclusively talked about in either the hurricane, the hurricane effects from Hurricane Irma, and how the gentrification made it more challenging for working class people to live in Key West. And a lot of them now commute from upper islands. And I think in the upper Keys, a lot of people commute from mainland Florida down, but not a lot of people connecting it directly to the shoreline. Probably the closest is the kind of working class ecotourism employees that highlight how they rely on mangroves for like eco tours, and a lot of their staff also, they need employees as well, and sometimes now people are driving a lot further than they would have. But those are one of the areas where the models are pretty separate. A lot of the people focused on insurance and gentrification aren't thinking that much about shorelines, and the shoreline habitat people aren't thinking that much about insurance and gentrification from what we're at least seeing so far.
Got it. Thank you for that response, Stephen. We received another question that might build on that response. So a participant named Vincent is curious, are insurance companies beginning to recognize the value of nature-based solutions as it relates to property protection and consequently policies and premiums?
So I can't comment on that last one that's kind of specific, but I can say like big picture, the insurance companies definitely seem to be, and it makes me think of some work that Mike Beck out of UC Santa Cruz has been doing, where his group has been working quite closely on risk reduction with insurance and reinsurance. And I know that they've shown a lot of case studies where there's measurable value in nature-based solutions on that property protection area, and the insurance companies seem to be very tightly connected to those projects. I don't know specifically on the rates and deductibles side of things how that translates. I will say though that that's what that firm organization in the Keys is very deeply focused on. So we're trying to learn more about that. They're one group, but they're a very important group in the network and specifically on a topic. So sorry, that's probably not. I'm not able to answer that one as well as some others probably could.
No problem. That was a great answer, and thanks for bringing in another scholar's research to reference on this issue. Okay, another question for Stephen. This question comes from Skylar Shibuya with the Fish and Wildlife Service. He asks, Stephen, can you explain the scenario modeling aspect a little more? As far as I'm aware, FCM models how people perceive the system works, but not necessarily how it may actually function. So what conclusions are you able to make?
It's a great question, and it's one that we get a lot. So the benefit of, so the first part of that, how do the scenarios work? So the scenarios work in that you have a graph-based model with all of these connections that are directional, so they're positive or negative, and they're weighted, so you can weight them how strong the connections are between the two. And so the scenario analyses allow you to manipulate one or more of those concepts up or down, and then see how the rest of the network responds. And it's telling you essentially relative increases. So this would increase or decrease, compared to its baseline state within the model. The question though about is this a real outcome is one that we get a lot. And what we would argue the benefit of FCM is that you can represent things in FCM that you can't represent in other models. So how would you represent satisfaction in an empirical, observational model? Like satisfaction is something that you really only can represent in a socially driven model. So I think a future is trying to connect models, connecting the social networks and connecting them to FCM, and ours is something we would love to connect them to agent-based models and some of the other more empirically driven ones in the future. But that's a big frontier for us that we'll look at going forward. So yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that response, Stephen. We've got just a minute left, so I'm going to hand things back to Aaliyah to wrap us up for the day.
Yeah, wow. Thank you everyone for joining. We had so many questions, and we'll be sure to share them with our speakers and share them on our website. But please check out our next webinar, which will be next month. We'll be talking about considerations for integrating nature-based solutions in planning. And as a reminder, this webinar was recorded. Our future webinars will be recorded as well, and we'll be sending that link out to all of our participants today. So thank you to our speakers, thank you to our participants, and I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and take care.
Thanks, everyone.